It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Arvind Rajagopal, as part of IRCPL's ongoing series on rethinking public religion in Africa and South Asia. Professor Rajagopal is a professor of media studies at New York University and also has affiliations to the sociology department there and the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis. I think the idea of having a series on public religion without featuring the work of Arvind Rajagopal is, to my mind, inconceivable. Ever since the 2001 appearance of his landmark study, Politics After Television, Hindu Nationalism and the Reshaping of the Public in India, Professor Rajagopal has spurred those of us interested in the intersections among politics, media technologies, and the public sphere to grapple with such a rich set of examples in the book and such a sophisticated analysis. And I say this as someone who doesn't study South Asia, but as someone who has done research in Africa. And within African studies, his influence has been very significant. So it really kind of transcends the regional focus, given the sophistication of this work. Particularly careful attention, I think, to the ways in which media get calibrated or calibrate the sensorial regimes of reception, as well as the very channel of what gets understood as religious or not. For all of this, of course, there is a dispiriting sense in which the particular topical and regional or national concerns that he has been focusing on for several decades now remain relevant, even perhaps more, unfortunately, than 20 to 25 years ago. For as we know, Hindu nationalism and populism are alive and well. And that, at least in part, is the subject for today in his lecture entitled, as you can see on the screen, Technopolitics and Hindu Populism. So before welcoming Arvind, let me just acknowledge the generous support of the Henry Luce Foundation, which has made this series possible, as well as our co-sponsors for today, the South Asia Institute, the Institute of African Studies, and the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. So please join me in welcoming Arvind Rajagopal.
Thank you very much, Matthew. It is quite true. I never imagined that my work would remain relevant for the length of time it has, and that the problems that I wrote about would only grow in magnitude and complexity. So for this talk, I've tried to summarize and offer some sort of a digest of different phases of the work that I've done on Hindu nationalism, trying to bring it up to date. I don't think I've quite succeeded in bringing it as up to date as I would like. I've done what I've been able to in the time that I've had, so I hope the conversation will let me take the talk to bring it to the kind of conclusion I would have desired if I had had enough time and so forth. The current ruling party in India has used a historic electoral majority to carry out policies that have undermined economic growth and adversely affected businesses. There have been tax write-offs to the well-to-do, cutbacks in social welfare, transfer of wealth back to upper classes, reversing a trend of diminishing inequality that was witnessed for the first several decades after independence. Attacks on the poorest and most marginal communities have been frequent. Unemployment is at a 40-year high. Growth is reduced by at least 2 percentage points. Capital investment is low. Tax collection is reduced. All these factors led experts to predict that the BJP could lose at the polls last year. And yet, the polls yielded further electoral success. The BJP actually increased its seat total between 2014 and 2019, the national elections. the lower castes, the poor, women, rural voters, in short, all the groups most adversely affected, are voting in larger numbers than before for the party, and the distribution of voters across the social spectrum fairly mirrors the caste, class, rural-urban and gender spread of Indian society itself, even including the lowest, historically untouchable castes at the bottom of the Hindu hierarchy. The youth and first-time voters prefer the BJP more than other parties by a substantial margin, and have done so in increasing numbers, moreover, between the elections. There is, of course, one notable class of exceptions that will surprise no one with any knowledge of contemporary Indian politics. Minorities are only minimally represented, notably Muslims. This is also reflected in the BJP's elected parliamentary representatives, amongst whom there is, for the first time in any ruling party, no Muslim member of parliament. It's hard to even say that, but it's true. This in a country that is the second or third largest Muslim country in the world. Campaign rhetoric endlessly repeats the notion that Muslims have 40 or 50 countries in the world they can go to, whereas Hindus have only one country. What is clear, however, is that Muslims in India are experiencing accelerated marginalization, and they have nowhere to go for relief. Any party associated with the Muslim cause, however distantly, is stigmatized and risks a loss of legitimacy, as we are currently witnessing with the Aam Aadmi Party in the Delhi Assembly elections, where the voters go to the polls on the 8th of February. Meanwhile, a dizzying number of major legislative moves since the party's victory in May last year indicate the ambition to remake the polity by claiming new kinds of police powers and new forms of intimidation, by determining who is and who is not a citizen, for example, and by accumulating new surveillance powers over the whole society. And in the process, the hope is to secure an electoral majority that will last for the foreseeable future. The impression one can easily get is of an unstoppable and growing power, of an invasion of brain snatchers that have turned the minds of Indians away from the world as we know it towards a new and poorly illuminated future, where the reinforcement of caste hierarchy and religious prejudice goes along with rockets launched to Mars, and where the country's nuclear arsenal grows, cheered on by hundreds of millions of people. Appraisals of the BJP often evince a bedazzlement by its power, and critics' protests are often muffled by what is now called Godi media, lapdog media, but with the play on their new hero, Modi, Prime Minister, who was, less than 2 decades ago, widely identified with the mass murder of more than 2,000 Muslims in Gujarat, and is now called Hindu Hriday Samrat, ruler of the Hindu hearts, a title coined for Mumbai-based Hindu militant leader, the late Bal Thackeray, that the BJP has sought to adopt for its own leader. The latest phase of globalization after the end of the Cold War had been greeted as representing, among other things, a retreat of the state and a flowering of human freedom. What we witness instead is something more complicated and offers little cause for celebration. It certainly involves a reinforcement of the repressive apparatuses of the state and a realignment of the ideological apparatus of the state as well. In fact, we struggle to gain an historical perspective of the meteoric rise of a party that distinguished political scientists, for example Paul Brass, had stated were not worth discussing at all as late as the 1980s on account of their minuscule vote share. It is helpful to recall that not only were the media apparatuses of the state, but as well, the state itself was always a mediatic project. This was especially the case in new nations, however old they believed their history to be. Devices, symbols, and stratagems had to be sought to persuade the electorate of the legitimacy of nationalism and of the competence and credibility of postcolonial regimes. To recall Philip Abrams's observation that the state is not an entity as such, but is rather an assemblage of effects attributed to it, we confront a conundrum with the BJP. Objectively poor performance on numerous registers that voters habitually judge governments by, namely what difference it makes to their material lives, followed by an even larger electoral majority than had been won in the previous election. This is a conundrum that we can seek to account for, even if an exhaustive explanation is as yet beyond our reach, by attending to questions of media and mediation. And this is the premise of my talk today. As it happens, I began to study the BJP in the late 1980s, provoked by the questions posed to me by an Indologist at Berkeley, Linda Hess, those of you know her, about the televisation of the Hindu epics, about what the televisation of the Hindu epics meant in a rapidly modernizing context. I wrote a book about the Hindu mobilization in this period, that he was kindly mentioned, that brought the BJP to power in 1998, and I spent the best part of a year studying the aftermath of the Gujarat riots, which happened in 2002, following which I wrote about the national emergency of Indira Gandhi in 1975-77, which I found was critical in shaping the conditions for the BJP's rise thereafter. That is to say, I have been following this history for some time now, not as a psephologist or as a political scientist would, but as a sociologist attentive to the history of the present. The current ruling party, the BJP, not only have a historic majority, its rule is itself historic in several ways. For example, in its aim to eliminate the chief opposition party entirely, even while paying elaborate homage to democratic process and to the will of the people. For example, their slogan for a Congress Mukt Bharat, a country purified of the Congress Party, which is the party that ruled India with little interruption until 2009 for more than 54 years. In keeping with this vision, the BJP has broken with a tradition prevailing since at least the end of the emergency to appoint a leader of the opposition on the grounds that all the other parties had won less than 10% of the total seats, which is the quorum in the Lok Sabha, the lower house of parliament. This fidelity to the letter of the law is greatest when there is a scope to advance the claims of power. On other occasions, such as, for example, the rights of political protest or protesters, every tactic that Cold War politics formalized, from white to grey to black propaganda, that is, from fact to insinuation to outright falsehood, is utilized. In India, popular understandings of the relationship with the state have tended to be transactional and even combative. To quote a Mumbai taxi driver once explained to me, "Agar hum bagavat nahi karte, to sarkar apna manmani karte. If we do not revolt, the government will do as it pleases." Protest now invites a wealth of counter-tactics, from fake news and official government announcements that equate protest with terrorism, to music videos celebrating state-sponsored counter-revolution and chief ministers endorsing vigilante violence. In the latest phase of technopolitics, the state's sovereign authority has morphed into something explicitly extra-constitutional, simultaneously internal and undeniable for the citizen, and external, variously brutal and compelling, countenancing no response other than consent or submission. There is a mode of analysis that has become familiar to anyone following the news. The violations of due process and basic norms seems to grow ever more egregious, with the constants being the failure of institutional oversight and the miscarriage of justice. After the BJP's 2019 victory, a number of legal changes have been set in motion as well, triggering disturbing escalations of violent actions and reprisals, but also heartening levels of courageous protest. A recent announcement by an analyst and a commentator on Indian politics has declared that the BJP is fascist. This has come as a kind of, wow, we can finally say it now. But one seeks analysis in addition to condemnation. The declaration of fascism is hardly a solution. One still wants to understand how voters go against what appear to be their own interests and freely choose a party that violates the law and claims unchallengeable authority against its rivals. Thus, my object of inquiry is what I'm calling Hindu populism, which, following Ernesto Laclau, I argue, is an ontological rather than an ontic category. That is, its meaning is not to be found in any particular ideological or political content, but rather in the mode of articulation of these contents, and it is in the styles of representation that the effects are seen. Let me say at the outset, populism is a term some analysts have rejected for the BJP because the party has not focused on economic redistribution and has cut back rather than expanded its predecessors' policies in this regard. Instead, they have catered to the middle class and the business classes, favoring the rich over the poor in most instances. But contemporary Hindu populism engages in redistribution of symbolic recognition, notably under Narendra Modi, whose success as a self-made man from a backward caste, incidentally a caste that was declared backward under Prime Minister Vajpayee in 1999. So, in fact, in Gujarat, the caste is not regarded as backward in a cultural sense. But Narendra Modi's rise as a self-made man is one of the most important aspects of his appeal, and in his own success constitutes an example of symbolic recognition and redistribution of symbolic recognition. Hindu populism also pronouncedly, if ineffectively and insincerely, is anti-elite and anti-corruption. For instance, with the policy of demonetization, about which I can say more, and the rhetoric against the Congress and its vote bank politics. Hindu populism also seeks to mobilize what Laclau calls an equivalential chain that connects disparate issues through empty signifiers, notably, of course, using words and images signaling Hinduness. Now, in the 20th century, sovereign authority emerged. The idea of sovereign authority came to a kind of new emphasis with the crisis of liberalism and the latter's inability to respond to exceptional problems that prevailing rules had not foreseen. And sovereignty was claimed in the name of the people, first with the Russian Revolution and later with European fascism. These claims could not have been secured without the use of technology. I'll note three features relevant in this context: the ability to conceive and execute action at a distance, the sense that human beings constitute the determining center of reality without quite comprehending that this is an illusion fostered by their identification with technology, as if it were an extension of themselves, instead of perceiving that it is something distinct and increasingly autonomous, and, relatedly, the transformation of the world into resources that can be stored and retrieved at will. As is well known, Martin Heidegger has referred to the resulting effect as enframing, defined as an ordering of the world as if it were of man's making, Heidegger's terms, as an unprecedented danger, but also as containing the remedy for this danger. The awareness of any remedy, however, is hardly self-evident. It appears only briefly and tantalizingly, Heidegger says. Now, Heidegger's discussion centers, as you would know, on the Greek term for making and doing, techne, which, following Aristotle, he distinguishes from episteme, which refers to knowing in the widest sense that leads to disinterested understanding. Techne, by contrast, is bound to context and necessity, and thus it became associated with questions of means as opposed to ends, the arts of the mind as applied to machines, as well as what we would now call the arts as such. In addressing the question of technology, Heidegger thus shifts away from an instrumental approach to think of it as artwork, as the art historian Boris Groys has suggested, intended not for utility, but offering a reflection of its maker and the world for contemplation. Technology fosters a misleading sense of mastery and control, but, perceived as artwork, it can clarify one's relationship to the world and enable self-understanding. It is in this shift, or this back and forth movement, I suggest, that danger can yield place to remedy. One way to describe this movement is in terms of a rivalry between the categories of aesthetics and politics for supremacy. If politics seeks to order the world according to instrumental reason, aesthetics imagines the world as it ought to appear. If politics has historically sought to relegate aesthetics to an ancillary status, the growth of technology has led to aesthetics playing an increasingly important and potentially destabilizing role. The task of politics in such a situation is not simply to capture power, therefore, but to find the justifications to retain it. And these are ultimately aesthetic justifications. This is an observation made by Friedrich Nietzsche. Witness, for instance, the valorization of the masses as agent or as ornament, whereby aesthetic claims can overtake or get the better of prevailing reasons of state and lead to change or not. For example, the Arab Spring. Other examples can be mentioned. To take another example yet, the idea of the political leader as philosopher king, which was so influentially revived by Lenin in the 20th century, has arguably been replaced by a different kind of leader figure, neither poet nor philosopher, but one who, in his or her own person, expresses aesthetic choices that thereafter become reality. Life imitates art, but through the directives of the leader, whose political performatives are channeled through copious streams of sound and images. Decisive shifts effected by leadership, whether Trump or Modi, it applies to both, I think, are not only political, they might be most persuasive as aesthetic appeals of order and beauty, of setting examples of how things ought to look and feel. If colonial governance required a modicum of technological growth across imperial territories, please forgive me, I know I have to cover a large, sort of territory here, so you must, I can see you. I'm jumping, yes, I'm jumping. It's unavoidable here. If colonial governance required a modicum of technological growth across imperial territories, it was during the Cold War period that technology transfer to the developing world became a means of claiming and contesting superpower influence. The term technopolitics emerged from the historiography of this period, in the work of Timothy Mitchell, for example, Michael Adis, Nick Calatha, and Gabriel Hecht. Focusing attention on technology as representing hybrid modes of doing politics, rather than simply as tools of politics. Power gets displaced onto technical assemblages that distribute agency and thus leads to unpredictable results. At this point, I will try to outline the broad arc of what remains of my talk today. I will argue for the productivity of technopolitics in the conceptual armamentarium for understanding Hindu populism, working through what I'll offer as an internal genealogy of Hindutva, Hindu nationalism. The conventional mode of analyzing Hindutva, Hinduness, stressed continuity in political history, and this posed a problem for analysis, since the BJP itself has emphasized that it represents a new beginning. For the BJP, for its part, has painted the period of Congress rule of its predecessor, as essentially like Stalinism, and the demolition of Babri Masjid, Babur's Mosque, which in 1992 was demolished by Hindu militants, has been described as akin to the fall of the Berlin Wall, with Nehru as a kind of murderous dictator supported by the communist bloc. The continuist approach in political history that I mentioned earlier is evinced in the work of someone like, say, Rajni Kothari, a prominent political scientist, recently deceased. Kothari's approach was to insist that India had a vibrant multi-religious society and that communalism, as it was called then, Hindu nationalism today, was limited to the urban middle classes and was provoked by competition for scarce economic opportunities. Hindu populism in such modernist terms was a contradiction in terms, since as an index of religion, the term Hindu pointed backwards in time, while populism, although not always rational, was nevertheless an expression of popular involvement in democratic politics and thus pointed forwards in time. The focus then was less on thinking about the novelty of Hindutva. In fact, any idea of novelty was emphatically denied. Critics opposed it to be little more than a remake of Nazism via the RSS, the ideological cadre of the Hindu nationalists. Such an interpretation concealed a more complex reality, expressed to me by a senior BJP leader in the mid-1990s, expressed in this formula: BJP minus RSS equals Congress. That is, the two parties were substantially the same, but the BJP had a cadre dedicated to its cause, which the Congress lacked. This remains an illuminating way to contrast the two main political parties. They have drawn from a common pool of support. One-party dominance has shifted from Congress to BJP rule. At any rate, this would be a perspective that stresses the political continuity from independence to the present. In my own work, both ethnographic and textual analysis revealed not a continuity in political history, but innovations in form that gained distinction around and through the televisual apparatus. The establishment of state-owned television, and specifically the broadcast of Hindu epics in serial form, beginning in 1987, that enlarged the scope of Hindu political mobilization and transformed, I suggest, the political landscape. At this point, I will try to summarize three phases which I believe are crucial in the genealogy of Hindutva, that of the emergency, the Ram Janmabhoomi Andolan, the mass mobilization that brought the BJP to power for the first time, and the Gujarat riots, which did occur when the BJP was in power, both at the center and in the state in Gujarat, and I think represented a kind of maturation of Hindu nationalist politics within its own terms that are worth noting. So the emergency, I suggest, can be seen as the high point of Nehruvian developmentalism and of the command economy that was instituted after independence, where import substitution industrialization and an economy where the state occupied the commanding heights and would determine the apportionment of resources, really occupied the leading place in the economy. And together with this, we had a kind of technopolitics, we can say, where the government substantially could rely upon the agreement of the other parties to concede it a substantial room for maneuver to occupy the place of leadership in the country as a whole. So, I mean, if you compare, for example, the political electoral manifestos of the Jansangh, which was the BJP's predecessor party, and the Congress party during this time, there is no question that the Congress was assigned the leading role, and the Jansangh made no attempt, it could not even imagine that it could occupy any position that would prepare it to challenge the Congress for power. And their activists actually would work for the Congress party to help it win in the elections, confirming the formula that I've just given you. What happened during the emergency, thanks to a political crisis where the Prime Minister was required to quit her office on account of electoral malpractice, 1975. The Prime Minister, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, Nehru's daughter, suspended civil liberties, arrested and jailed many opposition leaders, imposed censorship on the press, and declared that this would be a moment of enabling increased commitment to the national project of development. Yeah? To cut a long story short, the emergency was lifted after 2.5 years, clearly on the expectation that the Congress would win an election if people went to the polls. However, maybe this was a crucial mistake that she made. She allowed a 2.5-month period for campaigning when censorship was lifted and press were free to report as they wished. And during this time, major mass mobilization succeeded in displacing the Congress Party. And a crucial aspect of that was that the RSS was brought in, was made respectable. In the words of L.K. Advani, they ceased to be an untouchable party. And the post hoc analysis of the Congress Party's loss suggested that the consent of the urban middle classes was much more important than Indira Gandhi had calculated, and that she could not, in fact, rely on the votes of the rural poor, which until that time she had always assumed would tide her across any political criticisms that she experienced from the cities and from the educated classes. The second post hoc aspect of the post hoc analysis is that we witnessed this the emergency as a kind of transition period. Gyan Prakash has recently written about this as well, and I've had an exchange with him on some of the details in this analysis. There was a shift from a developmentalist economy centered on questions of political economy as such to one that came to be increasingly centered on issues of culture and media and focused increasingly on the urban middle class's consent. Last but not least, we witness, again in the post hoc analysis, a shifting sight in terms of the sites of sanctioned violence. And by sanctioned violence, here I'm thinking of the fact that industrial disputes, strikes and walkouts and lockouts and so forth, which had grown immensely during the 70s and really brought the nation to a standstill, plunge after the emergency, right? Industrial disputes, by and large, no longer have the place that they were earlier allowed. And what we notice in their stead is a growing graph in terms of communal violence, right? Hindu-Muslim riots in particular. Yeah? So I would see this as a shift in the in the political economy of violence, which illuminates in a way the shift in politics that is occurring at this time. So it is after the emergency that when Indira Gandhi comes back to power, the BJP, as it is then as it is called from this time onwards, becomes more significant, enters the mainstream of politics, and the two parties are essentially engaged in a competition for the Hindu vote. And by the end of the 1980s, towards the end of the 1980s, the second event that constitutes the sort of second node of the genealogy I'm discussing here, the mass mobilization around the Ram Temple, occurs at this time. And what enables it is a kind of mediatic apparatus that has been built over the course of Nehruvian developmentalism, prominently the institution of national television, which is understood and justified as a developmental apparatus. It is built with transnational support from different countries across the world. It is, in a sense, a global project to make India a site of capitalist success and a lesson to the rest of the world during the Cold War that, even if communism might lurk at India's borders and threaten the rest of the world, India was a reliably capitalist economy which could also be proven to be a successful democracy. And media, the growth of media, was seen to be crucial in this respect. Yeah, so again, since there are many histories intersecting with each other, the account I'm providing you, I can just briefly mention this. But India was, there was a great deal of international investment in India's success, and correspondingly a reluctance to acknowledge the failures that India exhibited in the course of its development. Therefore, for example, the emergency, although it was a serious violation of all the norms of democracy, never drew from the United States the kind of censure that perhaps another country would have drawn, because in fact India was in a special category. Yeah? So the second node of this genealogy that I'm trying to sketch for you is that of the Ram Janmabhoomi Andolan, or the Ram Temple movement. Yeah? And it marks a distinctive break with the postcolonial developmental order in at least 2 or 3 ways. Firstly, the rise of the non-committed voter as the focus of electoral campaigning, who required what BJP leader L.K. Advani described as, quote, the illusion that you are likely to come to power. And relatedly, the ways in which traditional politics presumed commitment that could be troubled by the work of mass mediation, since mass media specialized in conjugating illusion with reality for maximum effect. Now, the Ram Janmabhoomi Andolan, the mass movement aimed at demolishing Babur's mosque, which was claimed to stand on the birthplace of the Hindu god Ram, God King Lord Ram, was a campaign that was, in a sense, in a conversation with the Ramayana tele-epic. Yeah? So if you examine the texts of each of these series of events, they referred to each other, they borrowed from each other. The television series and the mass mobilization were, in that sense, interconnected events. And what is remarkable here was not simply that mediatic event of the campaign or the mediatic event of the television serial. There was another layer, of course, which was the news rapportage. And here what I found was critical and very interesting was the interplay between television and the press. And really it was in the press, in the print media, that the most sort of interesting work was going on. And that involved an interplay between the I examined the Hindi language media, the English language media, and what was noticeable there was that it was not the blind faith of the masses in Lord Ram or the need for him to have a temple at his alleged birthplace. Rather, one could say it was the blind faith of the secular elite in the blind faith of the masses. And this was, I think, decisive in making the campaign into something seemingly unstoppable. And I can say more about that. We have the time. Last but not least, in this sequence is the importance of the diaspora. The Hindu diaspora abroad was critical in conceptualizing, elaborating, raising funds for this campaign, and in conceiving the idea of an ecumenical Hinduism which could thrive around and despite caste differences, which was not a reality that was that could be experienced within the subcontinent, but it was something that came to fruition abroad, in the United States, for example. Yeah? The next, now, following the Ram Janmabhoomi Andolan, BJP came to power in 1998, and in 2002, there were the Gujarat riots. I won't bore you with an event history of it, simply to say, with the alleged provocation of 58 Hindu pilgrims being burned to death, immediately the cause was declared to be Muslims, although that is not clear at all. Ganchi Muslims in the town of Godhra. Incidentally, Narendra Modi is himself a Ganchi, so these were caste fellows, as it were, that he was engaged in a kind of rivalry with. But at any rate, after the death of these 58 pilgrims, a signal was given that there would be a police holiday for at least 3 days, and at least 2,000 Muslims were killed thereafter. Now, what is noticeable about the Gujarat riots is that, well, certainly the Congress party itself had frequently organized communal riots to come into power, to keep power, etc. What was different about the BJP was that in their case, and this was the first riot that they had overseen, when in power, it expressed a nationalization of violence, whereas the Congress had always tried very hard to localize it and to prevent it from acquiring a national color. Secondly, what we noticed here, what I noticed, was a socialization of the electorate into a kind of conspiratorial relationship with the leaders and against what they called outsiders. Thus, for example, one scholar I spoke to in IIM Ahmedabad, actually, he spoke to me of etic and emic approaches to the riots. And he said he favored an emic approach, whose details he did not share with me, but the point was to assert a distinction beyond adjudication. There are insiders and outsiders, and we are insiders. If you have an outside approach, well, you don't get it. That was the lesson. Furthermore, the narrative about the Gujarat riots hitched on to the global war on terror and described Indian Muslims as part of an international conspiracy and India's war against Islamic, its own internal Islamic enemies as part of a worldwide situation that India was proud to be a part of, right? So a kind of surprising cosmopolitanism that Hindu nationalism suddenly began to aspire to. Last but not least, there was a noticeable spatialization of the violence, demarcating territorial distinctions and oppositions in ways that I will try to illustrate for you when we come to the end of the talk, and I have some images there to show you. So I'm approaching the end of my talk. And here I have some concluding observations on technopolitics and on this issue of what I'm calling convergence across India and the United States, about Hindu nationalism itself, and about what I'm calling Cold War humanism. Yeah? So, today the leading capitalist firms operate not by extracting profit through the exploitation of labor time, we know, but rather by privatizing collective spaces and collective information that previously were not capable of being privatized. And because value is generated not through exploitation of labor power, so much as through renting attention, resistance has to secure other competing nodes of attention in the way, for example, that the protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act have done, whether in Shaheen Bagh in Delhi or elsewhere, and at the same time work against the privatization of the imagination being essayed by the dominant propaganda, so that while the government calls the protesters anti-national terrorists or Muslims, who are much the same thing in their mind, protesters are wielding the Constitution, the national flag, and using other means of asserting their belonging rather than their separateness. Just as there was an arms race to secure a decisive advantage at missiles, whose use, however, could have meant the end of the world, we are today in a situation where time seems to be of the essence and the winning party could secure an advantage that could last for a long time. But unlike the arms race, where the challenge was to pack more destructive power into smaller and lighter payloads, in this case, the challenge is perhaps first of all a political challenge, namely to find the arguments, images, and slogans that will not only prove attractive, but that people will proceed to circulate on their own. Memes and virality, namely the forces that make something contagious, are keywords in this process. Technological tools can compare and select meme-worthy communications, and they can assist in the viralization of communication, but the imagination to develop them is what is clearly the challenge. And here the BJP seems to have the advantage for the moment. And the matter of convergence. Now, convergence across the global north and south in political tendencies is, I think, noticeable in populist developments. Now, the dominant philosophical traditions themselves ignore the question of technology, by and large, since they focus on ends and relegate questions of means to a subsidiary status. So, in a sense, we are in uncharted territory in trying to understand these kinds of events, it seems to me. What is remarkable about the present moment is that while technology is increasingly influential, there is, on the one hand, a tremendous disparagement of politics as the arena of naked interest and calculation, and, on the other, a quest for pure principle and for actions treated as ends in themselves, rejecting any room for debate or doubt. We can understand this parallelism and negation or rejection of politics, understood as the realm of accommodating means to ends, and the preference for ethical action, of an embrace of doing the right thing, as correlating with the growing prevalence of technology itself, not an inevitable result, but rather a product of the way in which technology's growth has been historically adapted and accommodated in our historical present. And this bears on my point about Cold War humanism, which I'll try to come back to. Instrumentality and interested action have indeed increased with the growth of the market, but at the same time, in the place of the political, there is a shift away from adjudicative reasoning, not simply to a sense that the right action must be performed, irrespective of the consequences, but even beyond that there is something sacred at work. It brings people together, it confirms their unity. No opposition or moderation is allowed or considered. It affirms people's identity and belonging. The understanding here of technology as a vanishing mediator, even while relying on it for instrumental purposes, leads to an inability to disentangle and trace its effects. Instead, the realm of the pragmatic negotiation of competing interests, which from another perspective might appear a good thing, is spurned. So, a series of conclusions. Yes. So about Hindu nationalism. In a tradition where reality is beyond words and the truth has no essence, almost anything can be said about it. In fact, there is no religious doctrine as such to challenge, and certainly most of its proponents are ignorant of the doctrines. Hinduism as conjured for the political process today surpasses dialectical materialism. It is the most expansive philosophical system conceivable, if it can be called one. In such a context, the category of religion presents an opportunity rather than a problem. To be Hindu is an artifact of publicity rather than an expression of ancient mores. It is no surprise that a senior party leader has stated to an American embassy official that Hindu nationalism is an opportunistic issue for the BJP, a talking point rather than a core ideology. This we know thanks to Julian Assange, I believe. In fact, the electoral process has sanctioned a new language of political theology for the BJP. A phrase Modi is fond of repeating is Janata Jan Janardhan. Jan Janardhan, Jan Janardhan. Yeah? So, repetition. Suggesting that the will of the people prevails over the world. But Jan Janardhan is not a secular term for ruler, although it might strictly translate as that. It refers to the Lord Krishna. The addition of the word Janata for people being a democratic overlay or rephrasing, is part of a pedagogical thrust of ambivalent political speech, helping to operate as double-speak or double-think. Electoral success provides a supreme redemption in this understanding, negating merely juridical verdicts. It implies divine will at work, or is actually the manifestation of divine power in the figure of the elected ruler, who is like the king, but is sanctified by a formal democratic process. Western security experts understand Islamism as a case of blowback in the Middle East and elsewhere, but Hindu assertion seldom appears on their radar. Rhetorically deft and procedurally scrupulous, senior leaders deny Hindu identity while relying on its use in their campaigns. Western analysts typically assume a confessional model of the political party, but most parties, certainly those in India, center around leaders, history, and identity, and the ideology is flexible. Worldly power and not martyrdom is the goal. Political authority is the end towards which this new kind of religious identity is created, applicable across caste groupings that not long ago were excluded, prominently the former untouchable castes that constitute about a quarter of the population. There is no exact historical parallel for this event. Other major religious identities in contemporary times either pre-exist or have coexisted with their political manifestation. Suffice it to say that the category of religion here is a heuristic in analysis, and on the other hand, a strategy in terms of its political formation. Here we can mark the relevance of post-Westphalian and post-Hobbesian developments that are both historical and theoretical, and that sanctify religion as both an expression of conscience and as limited to the private sphere. This source of credibility clearly acquires a new salience amidst legitimation crises of the state and political responses to these crises. A tentative hypothesis we can offer for the changes taking place is that Indian society is democratizing, but in a Hindu way. If, as B.R. Ambedkar has argued, Hindu unity is constituted by caste Hindus' shared aversion towards untouchable castes, electoral democracy has introduced a new dynamic into this process. The exclusion of Muslims from political visibility is accompanied by the increasing political visibility of Dalits, who are, of course, the soldiers for Hindutva. The new basis for Hindu unification is the exclusion of Muslims, alongside the formal subsumption of Dalits. The register of exclusion shifts in the process from untouchability to invisibility. Media expansion enables more coordinated and extensive forms of exclusion than were previously imaginable. Political dynamics have both anticipated this development and furthered it. So this concludes the written portion of my talk. I think what I'll do now is to actually work through the images, and then that would open up other registers of analysis. All right, yes. Terms like technology evaded the political currents of the Cold War era, and here I have, here is a Google Ngrams, which shows you the prevalence of the word technology as opposed to some of the other most contentious words, I would say, that chart the developmentalist period in India, which is basically this kind of war between the private sector and the public sector, which was the way in which the Cold War was staged in the Indian context. And you can see here, of course, this is all books, not just India, but it offers you some idea, I think. And the next several images give us a glimpse of what I'm calling Nehruvian technopolitics. This was the Congress election symbol for general seats, 1951-52 election. Yeah, bullocks yoked for plowing. And this was the English language election poster for a stable, secular, progressive state. Nehru's image is much bigger than the cows here. Vote Congress. And this is the Hindi poster, where Nehru's image does not appear, right? And it lists a series of achievements of the party, namely it's one independence, etc., etc. Yeah, we have the cows, but so we see here that the English language poster, which was presumably addressed to an educated audience, has very little text, mainly image. The opposite is the case in the Hindi language poster. It's one of the bazaar art images that I found thanks to Tasveerghar, online database of images. Nehru as viceroy, I guess. Now a series of cartoons by Nehru's friend and a senior journalist, Shankar, who edited a magazine called Shankar's Weekly, and he would offer commentary on political affairs with his cartoons. And here we have this remark about the communalist, yeah, the Hindu nationalist, looking on while the debates were about capitalism and communism and socialism. That was something that was in a sense outside the battle, but waiting to take off, as it were. There's another one which gives us some sense of how Nehru was kind of a love object of much of the rest of the world during this time. Yeah, it's a kind of a sex object, actually. Yeah, it's, and confirms, I think, my point, offers some verification for it, that India was a site of enormous international investment, as there was a keen desire that India should succeed and a reluctance to accept any idea of its failure. Another image from Shankar, 1949. Yeah, India's prestige has risen in the international sphere, but it was at the cost of ignoring actually what was in India. Nehru stood for India, right? So he really represented the country to the rest of the world, while within, the less you knew, the better it was, because it wasn't pretty. A sign of Nehru's willingness to accept criticism. This is on his visit to the United States. The Niagara Falls was greatly impressed when it met Nehru for the first time. Yeah, it's making fun of the fact that he talks too much. He talked too much. And Nehru would invite Shankar over for breakfast and so forth. I mean, he had no problem with this. India, that is Bharat. Yeah, so again, it's a 1950 cartoon. But Shankar was astute in perceiving that there were tendencies that were very difficult to actually make coherent politically, and that Nehru's leadership was quite crucial in bridging otherwise unbridgeable divides, essentially Hindu nationalism and modern economics, as it were. Similarly here, yeah, arguments about what the national anthem should be. The national song and the national anthem. Yeah, Vande Mataram, Janagana Mana. It's a reference to non-alignment with Stalin on one side and Truman on the other. Nehru leading the non-aligned world, no alignment with blocks. And this is just an advertisement from about the mid-1960s. And it's a sign of the way, in a secular imagination, you could actually use caste symbols, use caste names, and still pass for secular, because that was the default assumption. Yeah? So this combination of Shaivite and Vaishnavite Brahmin symbols as the kind of affirming the excellence of the technocracy in Guest-Keane Williams could pass as secular imagery, although it may not do so today. All right, so the Babri Masjid campaign, a series of images here. This is the, it's not quite where it began, but this was certainly the stimulus for making the campaign into something major. When the BJP observed large audiences for this serial, they decided to invest their political capital on the campaign. And this was an image that was often used, where they pluck the individual figure of Ram away from the pantheon within which he was always depicted, so that it would better enable individual identification. And of course, he's shown not having completed all of his tasks and embodying perfection of humankind, but rather as an ordinary mortal with unfinished tasks that he is striving to complete, notably, of course, recapturing his birthplace. And that's the image of the intended temple in the background. And on the right, we see the Babri Masjid, which was demolished eventually in 1992. The left, the proposed temple, which is now, I guess, going to be built. And this is an image indicating the way in which popular processions and events would mimic the costumes and paraphernalia of the characters in the TV serial. So there was a carryover from television to real life. This is the moment of the demolition itself. I don't know why the photograph is in black and white, but I couldn't find a color one. Popular anti-colonial nationalist imagery. Just to remind ourselves that technopolitics didn't begin after independence. It was alive and well before that. And there was a series of images which many scholars have analyzed, Chris Penny, Sumati Ramaswamy, and so forth, putting the leaders of the Indian struggle on a plane with Hindu deities. Yeah, and of course there's no Hindu deity that is not armed and dangerous. And here's the Gujarat riots. This I think is a work of collage, but it saves us, it's a useful image. And relatedly, this is continuing the Gujarat sequence, ghettoization of Muslim spaces and monuments in Ahmedabad, which is the largest city in Gujarat, and where the bulk of the riots occurred. And this is extracted from an essay I published, so that's the... Now, the major monument in Ahmedabad is the Jama Masjid, the 15th century monument. And when I tried to find it, I was going back and forth in the street, but there was no sign and no evidence of where this gigantic 15th century monument was located. And then I realized that orange grill at the end was where it was. But there is no other indication. And then you go inside and it's simply enormous. It's simply enormous, yeah? And this is an example of the kinds of territorialization that were going on, courtesy of the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, the BJP's paramilitary, one of its paramilitary outfits, essentially claiming this space as theirs. Yeah, here's a translation. Hindu Rashtra's Shahpur branch welcomes you wholeheartedly. Each Hindu will become proud. The Hindu nation, your glory will be forever, even if we stay in power only for a few days. So there's this sense that their sights were set on much higher things than merely political power. National emergency. This temporal sequence is when I wrote it rather than when they occurred, but Sanjay Gandhi, who was inaugurated a youth congress at this time to galvanize the cadre. Publicity centered on family planning was one of the main programs, and that brought the party a great deal of grief in the end. The artist M.F. Hussain lent his services to the emergency. He drew a series of diagrams promoting the 20-point program. Here's a couple of them. There were also billboards, popular advertisements. So Amul Butter was punning on the notorious MISA Act, which was responsible for jailing thousands of people, became a story of consuming butter. And good butter. Good butter. Now, these are three graphs here. Here, this one shows the plunge in the number of strikes and lockouts in the essentially from the emergency is the high point of strikes and lockouts, and it comes to very nearly zero by 2007, and we could extend that story till the present time, but I don't think the graph would look very different at all. Now, in terms of man days lost, the picture is a little bit more complicated because there are a number of one-day strikes or shorter strikes, but the long strikes that could force the hand of management those are much more rare now. And whereas communal violence at the same time really rises greatly. Yeah? This is from this is police data, essentially. A few figures on the changing electoral fortunes of the BJP vis-a-vis the Congress. It's a national election sample from the Lokniti CSDS survey of 2019. And here you see the rising vote share of the BJP vis-a-vis the Congress. Yeah, and some breakdowns here. I don't know how much time we have, but
not much.
Yeah, right. So the cumulative picture is basically that the those who vote for the BJP pretty much mirror the class, caste, and geographical and gender spread of Indian society itself, and in fact they substantially represent the kind of voting pattern that the Congress Party used to have in its base when it was in power. And a few examples of political rhetoric today. Sonia Gandhi sheds tears for terrorists, according to Chief Minister of Haryana. Terrorism as a result of Congress appeasement. Congress wants to give full freedom to stone pelters, those who support terrorism. And this is a February 8, there was a one-day strike, and basically an example of protest. Now, I said I would talk about Cold War humanism, but maybe I will just hold that for the questions, if there's any about it, and if no one asks me about it, I'll tell you about it anyway. Thank you. Okay,
Arvind, thank you so much. Maybe I can just open with a brief question and then turn it over to the audience, many of whom I know will have more informed questions than I can formulate. You've given us so much to think about, and I think, in keeping with your work, focusing as a kind of through thread the relationship between media and messages, the relationship between ends and means, and as you pointed out at one juncture, the incredible power of certain technologies, certain mediums at particular moments in time to function as vanishing mediators, as if there is a kind of, which is, of course, I think, crucial to many forms of politics and also religious life. The idea of a kind of unmediated connection, right? Certainly central to forms of populist rhetoric today in many parts of the world, where Twitter and other platforms allow for a certain, or at least the construction of a certain image of immediacy and directness. Right? I think my question and the answer can be brief, although the question is very large, because I do want to get to our audience. But can you say something about how to understand the relationship between the medium and the message for the BJP over the past several decades, right? In other words, if to what extent is the message or the ideology or the sincere set of goals or insincere set of goals connected to the media through which they're being played out? I mean, is there? So, given the work stretching from the kind of 80s with the nationalization of television and the staging on television of this epic through to today, I wonder if you could just speak briefly to that.
Right. Yeah. So my tendency is to think about the contents of the communication as being less important than the ways in which they're communicated and the means through which they're communicated, styles, modes, and structures, rather than contents. So that the same thing said at a different time would not have had the same impact. The same thing said through different means, under different circumstances, demonstrably did not work in the way that it did, as we've seen here. So, to that extent, as I said in my paper, the category of, so if they were promoting Hindu identity, if they were promoting, the Hindu god King Ram, Lord Ram, it was certainly to their advantage that in the Hindu religion, the category of God, as Louis de Moore has pointed out, is epiphenomenal. And so there could be no objection to introducing a God that was actually not part of the daily worship practices of many Hindus. That had been, in fact, the concern of earlier Hindu nationalist leaders, that they should take great pains to avoid all mention of any Hindu god, because it would be sure to divide their audience, whereas their aim was to unite it. And because what they wanted was a Hindu nation under their biconnuate saffron flag, which for them represented the living God that with the incarnation of Hindu spirit, right? So it seems to me that, as it happens, it was with the establishment of national television and the accident of the Hindu epics that enabled that coming together, which then allowed a certain kind of Hindu appeal to gain the traction that it did. So that's one. That's my first answer.
Thank you so much. So, can I open it to the floor? Yes.
Thanks for the wonderful. You did praise the rise of political populism along the way. And I was wondering if you could say something about the ways in which the Anna Hazare movement is kind of linked to the more recent rise of the Hindu right. Because in a way, at least this, and I think we have kind of forgotten about this because all this kind of moves so quickly these days. In a sense, the rise of Modi in 2014 was immediately preceded by kind of spectacular rise of the Aam Aadmi Party and success of these protests. And the role of the media, if you could say something about it, in the sense that...
In that, yeah.
And how it's changed from there.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Well, I have some thoughts about the Anna Hazare, the anti-corruption campaign that in which the media were prominent. Now, historically, when the media covered popular protests, their concern and the news emphasis was always on law and order. Always, you know, is order being maintained? Is it being disrupted? Is there any violence? Is there any threat to peace? And if there's no threat to peace, in a sense, there's no news, right? So there was a kind of establishmentarian tendency to downplay the message and to simply document or, you know, chronicle the existence of the whatever, you know, protest it was. What was interesting in that respect about the anti-corruption campaign and the, you know, anti-rape campaign that followed, Nirbhaya and so forth, was the extent to which the media became partisan and actively promoted, propagated, fanned the flames of popular protest. That had never happened before, right? Incidentally, it happened under the Congress government, which was, I suppose, you know, more tolerant on issues of criticism than certainly their successor party. Now, what was interesting about that coverage was that, you know, I tend to read the media and entertainment industry annual reports, which can be very interesting. And I found in the annual report of the following year that they were taking credit for the movement. And essentially, I can't reproduce the exact prose, but there was a sense that there was the Arab Spring and India ought to have its Arab Spring. And the Arab Spring, of course, was a tremendous boost for social media and for the media companies in general in that part of the world. And it seems to me that the media industry saw this as an opportunity to grow their audience and to actually sanction protest. And to test this assumption, I had the good fortune to meet the president of Times TV, Times of India TV in Bombay. And I posed this question to him, and he did not deny it. He said, thank you, you know, and I said, congratulations on the work you've done, and thank you. Yeah. Now, the word is that Times of India sought to occupy the sort of leading position in this, that they were actually doing a market test where they would promote this campaign and observe its reaction in the other media which were downstream. Yeah? And in a way, it was an endorsement or a confirmation of the ability of English language media to be the drivers in the news cycle. Yeah? So, in a sense, it is utterly a story internal to the media business, disappointingly so. But that's what I would stress. Yeah?
Yes.
Arvind, it's always a great pleasure to listen to you. Partly because the abstractions often go over my head, and then I have to take notes and say, well, I really have to think about what he's saying here. But at the same time, you know, there's a lot of very specific material to try to come to terms with. Like, almost in passing, you mentioned how I assume you agree with the people who don't want to call BJP populist, since they don't actually engage in redistribution.
No, but as I said, they engage in symbolic redistribution of recognition. So I think they do seek to link diverse demands together, demands that are otherwise quite unconnected, through empty signifiers, which in their case are uniformly Hindu, however. Yeah, so there are aspects of their activity which are, they fit the bill.
But I think, as you implied,
Yeah.
in terms of, say...
They're not interested in the poor as poor, no. Yeah.
So, I think where, you know, my own thinking maybe diverges is, and again, I very much appreciate your comments on the role of Ramayana in the Janmabhoomi movement, and very, very important to keep those in mind. All that said, we look at the immediate recent past and BJP regaining power and so on. And similar things happening around the world, right? Philippines, England, US. It's not at all clear to me that the media or this social media and so on are so important. On some level, I'm not able to see a big difference between the way the majorities in these countries view others, minorities, as very different from what was the case, say, when we had communal riots in the 60s and 70s. Basically some rumor would spread, and the majority community would say, oh, we have to,
Right.
take revenge and go out and do something, either against Dalits or against Muslims. And on that level, I don't see a difference between the majority's behavior then and now. Now, there is a seeming wealth of information that they cite.
Who cites? Sorry. The wealth of information cited by?
By these people. They say, well, we have evidence. Whereas it used to be my neighbor told me. Now they'll point to some posts or some YouTube videos or something as evidence.
True.
And like I have classmates, who cite these things. I even have a student, who told me today, that they're willing to forward the material on this, But I said, well, don't forward me. Let's just sit and talk. I sent you something, and from some lawyers, why don't you respond to those things based on what you have read? And so it's not at all clear that people actually even read these so-called things. So they just, as you said, empty signifiers. And so I'm not able to, I see the present situation as just something where a certain tendency around the world is able to gain power because the majorities don't actually care that much about economics anymore. They are much more moved by what you said, in fact, at the beginning of your talk. What is of interest to the urban middle class? These cultural aspects, their sense of identification, self-identity, and so on, and hatred of the other. And it seems to me that's what is at work. So it may not be so important whether we have social media or not. Sorry.
I mean, I wouldn't be prepared to go that far. It seems more an expression of economic despair, where there are no, where if you can't get a full meal, at least you have the right to humiliate somebody else.
Fair enough.
And so the right to violence is what is being distributed. That's the mode of redistribution of symbolic recognition and protection against sanctions when one does participate in that ritual of expressing, enacting violence. That's
thank you.
yeah.
Yes, question here and then. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for this talk. I think a lot of what you were saying on the aspect of political leadership is especially interesting, given that the sites that we see Prime Minister Modi visiting, for example, and often before elections, are sites like Kedarnath, not necessarily sites of Vaishnavite, of the previous sort of Ram Mandir kind of build-up. And we see these particularly staged photos, of him sitting in caves in the Himalayas, going on sannyas, and there is a particular political aesthetic to it, especially before an election, which seems to drive the idea of an aesthetic leader, as opposed to a leader who's out there like Nehru,
Not a Vaishnavite leader who loves the pleasures of the world.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. So, my question is not less form, but there's something, I wanted to ask you what it means to project the political aesthetic of that time, not just necessarily through TV media, but Instagram. Modi has like 34 followers on Instagram, Twitter, where these particularly staged images seem to project a particular aesthetic, especially before election time.
Sure. Right. Yeah. So these are observations, and
yes,
you would like me to ask the question?
No, I'm sorry.
No, I agree. It's well, I think the identification with Modi does give everybody pause, and it is a sight of wonder, which I think you're expressing and I share. Yeah, which is how is it so uncritical? How is it that in this technological age there seems to be so little savvy, a reception of the technopolitics of imagery which is being fed to them? Or is the need for something like this kind of identification what is available to them and experienced as empowering and making sense of the world, where nothing else compares in terms of its symbolic utility or explanatory power? These are questions. What I would sort of say alongside that, because that was not something I was able to talk about in my paper, is that the BJP has obviously been very successful in using Modi to win elections, but it has won elections at the national level, and the state elections are really another story. So that, they have been losing state elections. They will very likely lose in Delhi on February 8th. So it's a bimodal picture, and I have not actually sort of been able to describe that in all of its complexity, but that does interrupt the picture of this unstoppable power. Yeah?
Okay, we have time for only two more questions, I'm afraid. So we saw Jack and then Rajbir, and I'll take them together, and then maybe when we're done, other people can come up and ask you. But Jack, and then I'll take these back to back, and then you can reply.
Okay, sure.
Thank you.
Thank you
so very much. I thought that we're focusing on the moment of 1987-88 with the Raman and I've mispronounced it actually.
Raman Sagar.
Raman Sagar, there we go. I knew it belonged to something. It was widely observed at that time that it was a sort of miracle of public consciousness that 99% of Indian villages represented people who had somehow seen the epic. And then part of that story was that they were not all just Hindus, but they were just everybody, which did in a way point to a moment when the Ramayana as a story was not just a Hindu story. It was a story to which many people felt they had access and which they wanted to celebrate at the time of festival. But I think you very rightly point to the moment of the technologization, that particular technologization of the Ramayana as the moment when it did become a Hindu story in a new sense. So with that sort of as background, I'd love to hear what you have to say about the mobile phone. And the BJP's immediate skill in taking that instrument, which seems to have it in more sort of well, it's there. You're holding it in your hand, so it's widely shared.
That's right.
Many people of all kinds of levels and backgrounds are able to have it.
That's right.
May look a little bit different, but still.
That's right.
And you held it in your hand, so it's an actual aspect of the body.
Yes.
So.
That's right. Well, I mean, okay.
Can I
so
just
yes,
take
that's right.
question,
Yes, absolutely.
and then you can address them both.
My question was more about the genealogy that you sort of trace in Gujarat as like this sort of national, something the national imagination. And I was thinking about 1984, which was also national, and the Kingdom of Sikhs was concentrated in Delhi and up and all over India, and also identification with Indira Gandhi, sort of this leader that embodies the Indian nation, which seems to mirror what Shana is saying about Modi. Speak more about this, because then it seems like there is a state apparatus there, right? That was deployed, much like ours, right?
Totally, right. Okay.
So mobile phones.
Yes.
And 1984.
Right.
And then we'll have to.
Right. So I think mobile phones have lifted crowd organization, the enactment of violence to new levels, right? So I mean, so for example, the way in which you can assemble a crowd in a very short period of time, as we saw repeatedly happening in Gujarat, thanks to the mobile phone, and thereafter, you know, fast forward to some years later, to photographs, videos being taken, and these would become calling cards for aspiring youth trying to find employment, right? So violence through the phone, recorded on the phone, could immediately be broadcast, and it could secure them perhaps an interview. I mean, I think one would have to see it in the grossest of terms if one tracks the way in which mobile phone videos have been used to record and circulate images of unpunished violence towards minorities. Yes, there's a way in which the enactment of violence appears to be more under one's control. There's a miniaturization of the screen which renders the event manageable, and there is, I mean, this is extraordinary. For decades there were very strict controls on who could broadcast what. You know, even to publish a college magazine, I had to run through all kinds of hoops when I was in college. And now you have the cell phone, and everybody is a potential dictator. They can do, you know, they used to have stage a coup to capture the radio station, and that was the announcement of a change of regime. Now every single person carries it. I mean, so I don't think we're at the end of trying to understand how, you know, what kind of effect this has. I think we're just at the beginning of it. But it seems to me that the political power that it theoretically vests in the individual who holds it is incalculably greater than what was available to them prior to the advent of the phone. Now the phone is a two-way instrument. What we're seeing, however, is the extent to which it can be orchestrated into one-way communication. You know, so that's. But I don't think we're at the end of that development yet. Yeah. So, and Rajbir, yes, you're right. I think that is maybe the anti-Sikh riots in 1984. Perhaps can also be called a nationalization of violence, so that Gujarat was not the first, perhaps. Although I'm, you know, I mean, you know, this I know more from impressions than from actually immersion in the archive of it. But yes, I think there was a sense of, just as one saw in Gujarat, actually, you know, the Muslims have to be taught a lesson, but they will never learn, and we will have to teach them the lesson again and again, right? So this is the kind of thing one would hear there. Now, in the case of the Sikhs, what are we to say? You know, I mean, yes, it was pedagogical, right, among other things. It was meant to teach them a lesson, and but it's not repeated itself in the same way that the anti-Muslim violence has repeated itself. So. But it's not forgiven, it's not punished, it remains, yeah? And it's difficult to integrate into these other narratives. I'm sure you would have much more to say about it, but yes, thank you for bringing that up. Very important. Yes, Kavita.
Very quickly, sorry.
Go
ahead, Kavita.
Very short question. It's about how did you bring in the language politics in South India into this? I feel that the uses of language by the BJP, mostly a Hindi medium kind of communication, I find there's so many barriers to moving into the South. Why does that become marginal to the story of Hindi, Hindutva, and Modi? And Kerala is, of course, always seen as an outlier with communism.
So, right. Yeah. That's right. I mean, I remember sitting in a BHP rally in New Delhi once with some Tamil women from southern Tamil Nadu, and they were saying, you know, there are so many temples in our village, and they all require repair and restoration. Why only that temple? But we keep bringing it up, but they don't listen to us. They don't listen to us. They just want us to focus on that temple. Yeah. So it's not that these issues weren't there, but it seemed like an issue that was motivated by faith to at least these individuals that I was speaking to. Yeah. So their first question to me was, "Do you have bhakti? Right? Do you have faith?" And I lied. But so the registers of mobilization are not the same everywhere. And what's interesting is that there are symbols that are able to transcend the differences. And certainly Janmabhoomi was such a case. It was able to transcend the differences. So that's a short answer to your question. Yeah?
Well, Arvind, thank you so much for that incredibly stimulating talk, and you all for your questions. Apologies, those I didn't get to, but you're welcome to come speak to Arvind briefly now. So thank you, and join me in